QSO Today, Episode 362, James Anderson, K8OS. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers and accessories for the radio amateur, reminding you that ICOM now has some unique and effective communication systems for MCOM. More later. My thanks to ICOM America for their support of the QSO Today podcast. The QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo is coming again on August 14th and 15th. We have a lineup of over 90 amazing presentations, interesting exhibitors, and prizes. Entry to the exhibit hall is free, and a full convention pass that includes the 30-day on-demand period is available for only $10. We are back on the VFairs platform that we used last August, and we guarantee a smooth and flawless experience. In fact, beginning this coming Sunday, August 1st at 8 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time until Tuesday at 1700 PDT or Pacific Daylight Time, the Expo platform will be open to allow you to become familiar with it before the live weekend. During business hours, folks from Flex Radio and QSO Today will be in the demo booths for an eyeball video chat. Please drop by if you have a chance and say hello. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Ft7, your host. James J.B. Anderson, K8OS, will be presenting in the next QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo on August 14th and 15th on the topic of Vertical Yagi-Uda Array using wire elements, stealth HF gain on a budget. I thought it would be good to introduce the QSO Today audience to some of the presenters themselves. And while JB has been a ham for over 50 years, he is also an accomplished electronics engineer and radio astronomer. K8OS tells his ham radio story in this QSO Today. K8OS, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, JB?
Yes, indeed. How are you doing today?
I'm great, JB. Thanks so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, I was first licensed as a novice in 1964. And before that, I had been a shortwave listener for several years. Several relative to my age then. That would have been at least 2 or 3 years. I started out with a very simple super regenerative receiver kit. And like many others of like interest, of similar interests, I listened to the BBC and Radio Moscow, and I forget exactly what the station in Red China was, and also the station in Habana, Cuba.
Let's go back even farther. You didn't just wake up and say, I think I'm going to be a shortwave listener. There was something that attracted you to that, maybe something more fundamental. Did you have an interest in electricity or electronics as a boy?
Yes. And somehow, I think it was probably through Boy Scouts, I became aware of a magazine. I'm trying to think it was, I'm trying to think of the name of the magazine.
Popular Electronics?
Maybe that was it. Popular Electronics, yes.
But I would imagine if this started for you in elementary school, if you had an interest in, do you remember the Alfred P. Morgan books, the first electrical book for boys and those books?
No, I don't remember anything like that. Somehow I started reading this Popular Electronics book, and I found the topic of shortwave radio very, very interesting for whatever reason. And I'm not sure why I found it so interesting, but before I knew it, I had followed an article that said, well, you can take a broadcast band radio, and if you open up the tuning capacitors, the little trimmers on the tuning capacitors a bit, you can get the 160-meter amateur band. And I think that was where I first started listening to what might be, even though it's a medium wave frequency, I think it was where I got my first exposure to first amateur radio and also shortwave. And I was also trying to listen to very distant broadcast band stations as well. That's where it started. Unfortunately, I don't remember much beyond that. I think it was just a collection of things.
Now you say your first shortwave receiver was a kit. I think in those days that might have been the night kits.
No, this was something I don't even remember what the name of the radio was. I thought it was Philco or something like that. It was a 3-tube super regenerative design. I just remembered it had a little gray panel with all the peculiarities of super regenerative receivers. And I taught myself to solder. I read, I think I went to the library and found a book that said, well, here's how you solder. And I learned how to do it. And my family was very poor, so they weren't able to buy me a receiver or anything like that. So I also had a paper route, and for a very small amount of money, was able to acquire a receiver, and that's where it started. And I taught myself Morse code first from a book, and then by listening to other amateurs. Unfortunately, I didn't have an Elmer. There were no Elmers in my world, and so I learned all of this myself, through practical experience and reading, basically.
Did you have siblings that might have also have had an interest, or maybe they spurred the interest because they had no interest?
No, the world I grew up in, nobody was interested in such things.
And so what happened after that? I mean, you say that you got your first license in 1964. That would be what, the novice license, and that would be just from your studies?
Yes, just from my studies. A gentleman that I believe that I made contact with through the Boy Scouts, Walter Frick, K8QPW. He's SK now. He was the one who administered the exam for me. And what I found was that after I got on the air with a DX20, Heathkit DX20, and by that time, I had a different receiver, BC348 converted, which the IF was broad as a barn door, so I had a lot of problems with QRM. And in those days, the novice frequencies were really thick with signals. And at any rate, I got a lot better at CW once I got on the air. But I've always been more of a listener than a transmit sort of person, though. But I definitely got into the novice CW thing, and it was a lot of fun.
And what was the antenna that you put on the roof as a novice?
I actually built out of 2x4s, two, I would say, 20-foot towers, if you want to call it that, and guide them in the backyard and put up a half-wave dipole in with the far ends bent down toward the ground. So I don't know if there's a particular name for that kind of dipole. I suppose that it would resemble an inverted V, although it was like an inverted I don't know what, an inverted U, yes.
Well, that's kind of what I'm running here, because my lot is much smaller than the amount of wire that I've got running.
Yes. Well, much later, I learned that antenna worked quite well because most of the current is near the feed point, and that's where most of the radiation is. And so, and therefore, because of reciprocity, where the sensitivity is also. So that kind of antenna can actually work quite well. It does shift the feed point impedance a bit, but in a beneficial way.
How old were you when you first got your license?
I was 14.
So that would have given you a few years before leaving high school and going off to college.
Yes.
That you might have made a group of friends, other amateurs in the area as a result?
Yes, I did. I did meet, I remember... I'm trying to think. There was a young man by the name, his last name is Lipsky. He's now N8ZZ. He lives in Pennsylvania. I haven't had any contact with him since those days, but I'm aware that he's still alive and presumably operating.
Did ham radio play a part then in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Absolutely. When I was a young person, during this time, my dream was to become a radio astronomer. That's what I wanted to do. And so the shortwave radio, shortwave listening, amateur radio, all factored into that interest. And mainly it guided what books I read. I read many books. I read more books about astronomy and radio astronomy than I did about amateur radio per se, although I have to say that I studied QST very closely. That was later on. That was after I became an amateur, QST became something of a Bible.
So then what happened? Where did you end up studying?
So I went to school, and this is all in Ohio. My original call was WN8OST. This was in Toledo, Ohio. So I went to the local university and began studying what I would call engineering, pre-engineering type curriculum, calculus, basic circuits theory, network theory, and then later that accelerated quite a bit into the more advanced topics, circuit design, control theory, feedback, so on and so forth, amplifier design, what have you.
But it seems to me that you went on for more advanced degrees. Where did you get those degrees?
Well, I did a double undergraduate at University of Toledo in mathematics and physics, and then I did 2 MSs there, one in mathematics and one in optimal control theory. I was interested in designing the deep space missions at JPL, but by the time I finished, unfortunately, those missions were already over. So I migrated, in 1980, I migrated, 1982, I migrated to Minnesota and entered the doctoral program, first in mathematics and then later in electrical engineering. So I was involved in 2 graduate programs at the same time.
That's quite a background, physics, and mathematics. What did you end up doing when you left the university?
Well, perhaps I should tell you what I did at the university before I get into that. So I can tell you a little story. So one of the radio astronomy books that I had read when I was a young person, very young, it was just this little pamphlet written by a gentleman called Piddington, I believe. And in this book, in one of the sections, really a monograph, it talked about a very interesting type of low noise amplifier, and it's a variable reactance type amplifier. And so I took a class while I was at University of Minnesota over the microwave network. And it was with a gentleman called Aldert van der Ziel, very famous in the electronic noise world. I did very well in this class, but I never met him because everything was remote. And finally, I went out to the university and walked into his office, and I said, "Well, Professor," I said, "my name is James Anderson. Perhaps you remember me?" And he said, "Oh, yeah, sure. You did very well," and so on and so forth. And I said, "Well, do you have any problems for me to work on?" And so, lo and behold, before I knew it, I was involved in this low noise semiconductor research. And within context of that, one day I began talking to him about this variable reactance amplifier, and he said, "Oh yes, I invented that." And I was like, "What?" I couldn't believe it. And he took me to the office and handed me a paper, and sure enough, he was the inventor of this particular amplifier. So it closed a major circle, if you will. Somehow, when I was a very young person at 13, there was some sort of premonition that I would get involved with the person that who had done that work, who had done that initial work. And so that's just one of the stories. I got to study with this very, very famous gentleman and learned all about low noise analog design.
And what was his name again?
Aldert van der Ziel. He's very famous. Aldert Vanderziel.
Okay, I'll have a reference to him in the show notes pages of this episode. Okay, so what happened after that? It seems to me that you're now quite specialized.
Well, I was also doing a PhD in mathematics. And so I was actually working on two PhDs at the same time. And finally, the university, and I was almost done with the mathematics PhD. And finally, the university came to me and said, well, we have some new rules. You're going to get to choose one program or the other. But you can only do one PhD. And I said, well, okay, I'm almost done with the mathematics, so I'll do that. And in the mathematics, I was doing supercomputing, mathematical physics. I was doing a lot of work in numerical analysis, solving the kinds of equations that you do in electrodynamics, for example, for antennas. I was involved in that, and I was doing my research on the Cray there, so on the Cray supercomputer. And so I got involved in high-performance computing, and as well as mathematical physics. And so I graduated with a PhD in mathematics and an MSCE because they wouldn't let me do two PhDs. And my goal at the time was to become a professor, to enter the academic world. But at the time, I was raising children and needed a bit more money than an associate professor might make. So I entered the corporate world. And it wasn't long after that. I worked for a number of high technology companies, mainly doing hardware design.
Any we would recognize?
Sure. I was chief scientist at E.F. Johnson for 2 years. I also worked for Telex Communications doing theoretical acoustics, speech recognition type stuff. I also worked for Noran Instruments doing ultra-low noise front ends for gamma ray, X-ray spectrometers, and electron microscopes. That I really enjoyed that work. That was a lot of fun. And then after that, around 1995, I began taking, I left a secure job and began taking contract work in California and going back and forth. And that was where, and again, at this time, I was beginning to focus in topics related to mathematical coprocessors on what were the fairly new PCs, and also what would I call them? Auxiliary processing units based on FPGA, also chip design. But it kind of coalesced into chip-scale supercomputing. And so I spent 15 years doing chip-scale supercomputing, architecting those kind of chips for a series of companies in Silicon Valley that included Xilinx.
And now this message from ICOM America. You may know that ICOM America has been supplying radios to North American market for almost 50 years. You may not know that ICOM makes communication solutions for aviation, land mobile, and marine as well. As hurricane season kicks off in June and wildfire season is upon the West, ICOM has advanced emergency communication systems for emergency organizations, including your ARES, that would survive the loss of commercial infrastructures that serve these areas. In addition to ICOM's line of amateur radio products, including D-Star digital, HF, and analog radios, ICOM now has their new IC Sat100 portable push-to-talk satellite communicators and the IP501H and M LTE radios to offer very wide area communications for those state and region-wide emergencies. ICOM's IC Sat100 is the perfect handheld satellite radio for use outside of cellular or push-to-talk network range. By operating on Iridium's constellation of satellites, the IC Sat100 can quickly and easily connect with other push-to-talk devices from virtually anywhere. Mobile versions are also available. The IC Sat100 includes an emergency call button, the AquaQuake feature, which is an IP67 waterproof rating, and a vibrating function that keeps water out of the speaker. It has AES 256-bit encryption and a voice recording function. The IP501H and the IP501M radios provide instant wide area coverage over LTE. By using an LTE network, you bypass the need for pre-existing push-to-talk infrastructure, allowing nationwide coverage without the added cost of building and maintaining your own repeater network. A mobile version is available. These radios include priority interrupt calling, individual, group, talk group, multiplex, talk group, and all calls. Emergency button, lone worker feature, and man-down functions. Vibration alert notifications. Connect to all of these devices and more, even systems operating on different protocols, with the VE-PG4 ROIP or Radio over Internet Protocol Gateway. From land mobile and LTE radios to IP communication terminals and IP phone systems, they all work together to form one seamless and uninterrupted network, ensuring your emergency comms are received and forwarded. The VE-PG4 is your bridge connection between radio systems, an LTE transceiver gateway, an IP phone interconnect, a multi-site connection between other VE-PG4s, external equipment connection. ICOM's VE-PG4 solves all of your interoperability needs. Emergency communications groups and amateurs that serve them have complex communications needs, often beyond what amateur radio alone can solve. ICOM has the solutions to bridge any disaster situation to keep emergency personnel in touch. To learn more about these essential communication products from ICOM, click on the link in this week's show notes pages. And now back to our QSO Today. That's pretty amazing. And were you doing ham radio at the same time?
No, I was not. I was pretty inactive by that time, and because once you're in Silicon Valley and you're doing anything with involving chip design, that is extraordinarily intense work, and you pretty much don't have any time for anything else, including a social life. You just don't have time. You're trying to close timing on some chip design, and it's chewing up day and night, 7 days a week, that sort of thing.
I can imagine, and that's kind of the work style in the Valley as well. You kind of give yourself to them for a number of years.
Yes, that's pretty much how it works, yes. And so, for example, I'm the inventor of an entire class of supercomputer architectures on programmable logic, on FPGA. And, of course, Xilinx owns the patent, but I'm the author of it. And basically what I did was show how you could use multi-core implementation on an FPGA and set up interprocessor communications in a way that allows you to emulate all the major supercomputer architectures, whether it be Butterfly, Mesh, Torus, N-Cube, what have you. You can do that. And so that's the sort of thing I was involved in.
And now you're retired?
No.
You're not? There's no rest, right?
There's no rest for the weary. I'm involved in some entrepreneurial activities, and in fact, I'm CTO of Dimension Incorporated, and I've since around 2012, I've been involved in super resolution image processing technology. And in that work, I've been building systems on programmable logic, FPGA, but also multi-core and GPU accelerated workstations, and also edge compute architectures as well, but all doing super resolution type image processing.
Well, it seems to me then, JB, that you'll be coming to Israel at some point soon as Intel is done with their 5 office towers.
I hope so.
For Mobileye,
yes, that'd be
right?
fun. Yes, I hope so.
Let's slide back into ham radio a little bit.
Sure.
What's the current rig?
I have a Yaesu Ft7D that I'm using. I also have some older Yaesu rigs. I've become kind of a Yaesu person. I have an FT201 that I used for many years. I did a lot of DXing, both CW and single sideband. That would be in the late 70s, early 80s. And FT101. And
which is kind of a classic, right?
Yes, it's a classic rig, and it's a very, very solid rig. And for CW SSB, quite frankly, I love it. It's smooth as silk. I love it. And also right next to me here, I have an old Yaesu Ft7, which was it's kind of clunky mobile rig, but it works quite well. And occasionally in my bedroom here, where my 897D is, that I use exclusively for FT8, Digimode, FT8. And every now and then, though, I'll fire up the FT7 and work a little bit of QRP CW.
So that's your current rigs that you have. Do you operate mobile
Yes.
at all?
No, but I have a mobile rig. It's going to be a VHF, also Yaesu. It's going to be a VHF UHF rig, FM rig that I'll put in my car. I haven't put it in there yet. And then that rig, I can't remember the number on it. I bought it last year, and it's been sitting on a shelf in the basement until I get a chance to install it. But it also covers 10 meter FM. So it's 10.62, I believe. And yeah, at any rate, I'm going to install that in my car and soon. And I'll be able to operate mobile. The dampener on operating mobile is that the police might pull me over if they see my microphone in my hand. That's kind of problematic.
Is that the law in Minnesota?
Yes, in the United States. Yeah, in I think in virtually all states in the United States. So if I operate mobile, I'm supposed to pull over before I pick up the mic, and that kind of bothers me. Because amateurs have been, operating mobile for many, many years with virtually no problems. But, some people with their cell phones and so on and so forth are doing crazy things while trying to drive, like texting. That's insane. But it stimulated a number of laws that unfortunately impinge upon amateurs as well. So I do have something to say about FT8, about Digimode. And Digimode has actually been something of a renaissance for me as far as my involvement in amateur radio. In 2020, early 2020, I acquired a book from the ARRL bookstore. Get on digital modes, so on and so forth. I can't remember who the author was, but I purchased the book and read through it and acquired all the software, the WSJT software, and JT Alert and what have you, and got myself equipped. And just as I had done in the old days, I read up on it, kind of taught myself how to do it, and within a year, had worked all states, worked all continents, and DXCC, FT8 and digital, all within a year on 20 meters. And I'm doing the same thing now on 40 meters. So it's been something of a renaissance. I've probably operated more on Digimode than I ever did CWSSB back in the day. And I've thought often, well, why is that true? Because I certainly enjoy all of it, but there's something very succinct about the Digimodes that appeals to me. I've never been much of a rag chewer, or there are certainly people that I want to have extended conversations with, but most of the time I'm interested in the propagation. And the capabilities of my antennas or my rig or what have you, and so the pace of Digimode, of FT8, FT4, even PSK31 appeals to me in that context, and it's been quite a renaissance for me. I've operated much more in the last 2 years than I have ever done before.
Right at the bottom of the sunspot cycle itself as well.
Yes, indeed, and was able to do it right at the bottom of the sunspot cycle. And in fact, I'm within a few entities of DXCC on 40 meters, and unfortunately, cycle 25 is not proving all that good for 40 meters. I mean, it has its moments, but I think it's becoming more difficult on the lower bands. And now that implies it might be easier on 15 and 10, and I'm looking forward to that as well.
Are you still operating CW? You say you might run some QRP on the FT7?
Well, actually, what I'm going to do is to run some coax to my radio room in the basement where the FT101 is. And what I've been promising myself is DXCC all CW 160 meters once I get the antenna up. And I've been designing and planning that antenna for some time now. So before winter, it should be up. And I know that 160 is going to be degrading as cycle 25 progresses toward the maxima, but I've promised myself all CW on 160. And it probably all single sideband on 10 meters, because I had a lot of fun on 10 meters single sideband back in the day.
Let me take a quick break to tell you about my favorite amateur radio audio podcast, and that's the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KJ6VU, Jeremy, KF7IJZ, and it now includes Michael Walker, VA3MW, where they pursue topics, technology, and projects on their ham radio workbenches every 2 weeks. The group documents their projects and makes circuit boards available to their listeners. They have interesting guests and go in deep. Jeremy may complain about the overall length of the podcast, but friends, let me tell you that I could listen to it all day, and that's good. Even if you are a seasoned ham radio builder or just getting started, be sure to join George, Jeremy, and Mike now for the Ham Radio Workbench podcast on every podcast player. Use the link on this week's show notes page by clicking on the image. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today. Now, do you use any internet sites or internet tools to kind of give you some operating direction, like PSK Reporter or something like that?
I do. I have PSK Reporter. I have a 3-monitor system up here, and on the top monitor, I keep PSK Reporter.
So you kind of know what bands are open and where to go pounce?
Pretty much, but it's really interesting. PSK Reporter does not tell the entire story. I've noticed that, and propagation, by the way, in addition to antennas, is propagation physics. Also interests me a lot, and I've been enjoying myself attempting to come to understand the various nuances of propagation and how it changes as the sunspot cycle progresses. And what I've noticed is that the gray line propagation, as the sunspot and solar flux have increased, the gray line propagation has become very asymmetric. Sometimes I'll get some really good spots, but I don't hear anybody. Hear those people that are spotting me, and sometimes it's the other way around. And so I'm trying to figure all this out and relate it to the physics that we know about the ionosphere. And so that's an ongoing project, by the way.
Are you involved in HamSci and the boys over there working on propagation studies in the ionosphere?
No, I'm not involved with them. I am aware of them, and but unfortunately, I don't have any time at this point. My work activity is keeping me pretty busy.
You're always looking for another PhD.
Sure, sure. And let me tell you, ionospheric physics and solar physics, that's demanding of the highest order skill and knowledge in those areas. And so I can understand the involvement of PhDs, and because then you have some hope of being able to read the literature and understand the mathematics, and being able to build the simulations that you require in order to make good predictions and understand the processes involved. But it's very rich. And I'm looking forward to becoming more and more involved in that over the next few years.
You say on your Twitter feed that you use full-wave vertical loop antennas. Can you speak about this antenna and its construction in a city backyard?
Sure. It's a rectangular configuration. Well, I should say the initial configuration I used was a delta loop, and I did very well with it mainly on 20 meters. Now I have a square one that is fed at the center of one of the vertical elements of that antenna, and that's to maximize the low angle radiation. And it works quite well, and of course it's also resonant at integral multiples, so I use that same antenna that I designed for 40. I use it on 2015 antenna as well, and it performs superbly on all those bands. And basically what it does, the horizontal portions tend to cancel. There's a great deal of cancellation for the horizontal components of the radiation. So what you're left with is basically a phased array of two vertical radiators, and it works quite well.
So are you using a quarter wave on 40 meters is about 32 feet?
Yes.
So are you using masts that are higher in order to push that thing up into the sky and keep someone from strangling themselves on the lowest element?
Well, only my daughter has to worry about stepping over the lower part of that antenna as, she's going to one part of the gardens or another. So no worries there. But you're correct. Let me say that antenna doesn't have to be that high above ground in order to work quite well, because again, the horizontal parts tend to cancel in the far field, and the vertical parts add vectorially to create a very broad figure eight pattern. And as far as support is concerned, I have trees in my backyard that I'm leveraging. And by the way, just to give a little hint about what I'm going to talk about at your event, is I'm using some trees that are along the line of my property. I'm going to use that one vertical section of that 40-meter design, which is now half wave at 20 meters. I'm going to use that as a reflector, and I will use vertical elements that are supported by the trees along that line that are running east-west to create the Vertical Yagi-Uda Array. And that's how it will work.
So just to bring the audience up to speed, you're speaking at the next QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo on August 14th and 15th, and your presentation is called Vertical Yagi-Uda Array Using Wire Elements - Stealth HF Gain on a Budget.
Yes.
It's a lot to say at once, but you can actually read the presentation summary on our QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo website. Now, what is a Yagi-Uda array, and how did you bring this into the design?
Well, of course, reading QST and the Amateur Radio Handbook from the old days and looking at all the wonderful antenna designs, many of the highest performance ones are horizontal Yagi-Uda arrays that Yagi-Uda antennas that can exhibit very high forward gain and a very high front to back ratio. If for 20, 15, and 10, you can build these antennas. You can homebrew them, and you might need for 20 meters you might need a hefty rotator, but you can get very high performance from these antennas and rotate them, which is very nice. Now, Yagi-Uda are the surnames of the two inventors of this antenna. They developed this kind of antenna, which has one driven element and a number of director elements, director indicating the direction of maximum effective aperture, and then one reflector, which gives you your front to back ratio. And those elements are all parasitic; they're not driven, and you can get fairly high gain. So out of a 3-element array, 6 to 7 dB is not unusual. The advantage of the vertical array is that you get a preponderance of low-angle radiation, whereas the horizontal antenna is going to give you launch angles at I should say an assortment of angles, which is an advantage in some situations. For example, if the D layer is really active, perhaps low angle radiation isn't so much of an advantage, and a somewhat higher angle of radiation can work better for you. So at any rate, pre-World War II, these two Japanese scientists invented this antenna. And in the old days, we called it a Yagi. But the antenna was actually invented by Uda, who was the director of Yagi's PhD. He was his PhD advisor.
Okay, so you're using your vertical loop as a reflector, did you say?
Yes, I'm using one part of it that is in the near field, will be in the near field of these other elements.
One side of that vertical antenna.
Right.
Okay.
It's in the near field, so it will interact appropriately per the Yagi-Uda design. Yes.
And of course, it will be switched off or disconnected from the.
I'll short the feed point.
Ah, okay. With some kind of a relay or something like that out on the array, or just with a couple of clip leads.
I don't. It's. I made a special PL259 to short it, and so I lower the antenna, remove the connection to the. I have a balun, a 4-to-1 balun on that antenna, and I will just short it. So it will act as a passive element. It'll act as a passive element a bit longer than the design frequency that the driven element, which now I'll put up in west of that passive element. So you'll see all the details in my presentation because I'll have schematics, and it's a simple schematic, a diagram that shows how all this works.
And of course, because it's a vertically polarized antenna pointed away from the house, then you'll probably not have an elevation of noise, electronic noise that might come from the neighborhood or the environment.
Well, I'm experimenting with it, but I must say that I have not had much of a problem with noise at these frequencies. Perhaps I'm lucky. The only problems that I've had with any sort of EMI was when I had built a much larger loop surrounding my entire property for 80 meters, and that was last winter. And I began interfering with the DSL that is being used for my internet. And so it was at a frequency that overlapped some of the frequency content there, in my internet. And so I have fiber to the neighborhood. It's not fiber to my house. And so it's fiber to a box out on the corner, and then it's a twisted pair into my house, basically, using DSL technology.
That's what I have as well. Very common. Well, it's very common here. I actually haven't met a lot of people in America that are actually using DSL technology to the curb. So it's fiber to the curb and DSL into the house.
That's what I have. That's what I have.
Okay, so when you're using your vertical loop, do you notice a difference in terms of if you compare it with other antennas in terms of the noise floor, electronic noise floor that might exist around you?
No, not here. I know that some people have had problems with antennas and the vertical loop does, and particularly with the way I'm feeding it. Now, it acts like two-phased verticals because I'm feeding at the center of one of the vertical elements. And so the response of the antenna is essentially that of two vertical antennas. So I know that many people have RFI, EMI type problems with these type of antennas, but I've not had that problem. So I haven't had to worry too much with it. I haven't seen much. Last winter I did have that 80-meter horizontal loop that I told you about. I didn't see much difference in the noise floor. at all. Although I didn't do any scientific, this is very qualitative. I didn't do any actual measurements of it. It was just like listen on one, listen on the other. And the reason that I did this, of course, was because there was some particular DX station, and the 80-meter loop is also resonant on 40 and 20, 15 and 10. I would switch between the two to see if I could get this guy to hear me, this person, this station to hear me. And but I didn't notice any major difference. And then, of course, on WSJT, you can see what the noise floor is looking like. There's an indicator on the lower left, and didn't see really much of a difference. But that's in my locale. I know that will be location dependent.
And your lots are kind of large, actually, it seems. You're set back from the street somewhat, and the backyard is deep?
Yes, everybody else all my neighbors are in the far field.
How do you hang these antennas in your trees? Are you a tree climber?
No, I am not a tree climber, and that was a limiting factor initially, because what I was doing, I had a weight and a line, some zip line, and I was throwing these weights into the trees over a branch and then pulling the antenna up, one or another part of the antenna up. Well, that limited me in terms of how high I might get. And in fact, my initial 40-meter vertical loop was rectangular, and it was not, I could tell it was not optimal. I wasn't getting optimal performance out of it because I just didn't have the height on the vertical sides. So what I did was I took a hint from someone that I found on YouTube that was dealing with the problem of how to get lines further up in the trees, and this person did something very clever. They went to Amazon.com and bought an Arborist Slingshot. And now I can throw lines about twice the height that I could do by hand. And so that enabled me to get lines way up in my trees. And I have a lot of trees on a relatively large number of trees on my property. So I was able to get to the lines way up, and the performance definitely improved.
What makes an arborist slingshot different than maybe a regular slingshot?
Much bigger. Just take a regular slingshot and put it on a pole and make the slingshot part and the rubber, if you will, that stores the energy that you're going to use to throw this line over. It's much bigger. Is
that a two-man operation then when you do that?
No, it's single person. And you can also buy a trigger, so you can stretch it and then aim it and then press on the button and it pops it over the tree. It works great.
How about that? We learn something every day.
Yes, we do. So I'm giving you the hint just the way that I got it, word of mouth, basically.
I think it's a great idea. Now, I don't have any trees here, or at least the trees that I have here aren't high enough to use for antennas. But I know that most of the listeners probably are in places where they've got some kind of trees, and so it's good to know that you can use those. So you're a wire antenna guy. You don't have a tower on the roof.
Yes. That's mainly for my neighbors. I don't want to scare them. They already think that I'm talking to aliens.
You might be.
Possible. If you don't mind my interjecting something, I'm also still very interested in radio astronomy. And one of the things that I'm doing now, pursuant to that, is to assemble a system, a radio astronomy system that's capable of detecting various spectral lines. And so I already have a mount for a big dish, a 6-foot dish. And I have yet to find the dish. I've identified some commercial products, but I was hoping to just get one that I could, that someone wants to discard, like a C-band antenna, but one made out of solid aluminum or aluminum sections, so that I can run it up to about 8 gigahertz. So I'm actively involved in that right now, and I'll use an SDR receiver for that, and so on and so forth.
Have you tried something like Craigslist?
Yes.
It used to be these 8-foot aluminum dishes were quite prolific.
Not so anymore. What I discovered was that people who had no interest at all in electronics or radio or anything like that were using those dishes to make duck ponds. they would buy them and then basically excavate some dirt on their property and make a duck pond with it. That's, frightening. Yeah, sacrilege. That's frightening. But that's probably why so many of them have disappeared. But I'm actively scanning Craigslist, and I think Serve Up is another one, another website. But I'm actively scanning those for that jewel to come.
Well, I know that the guys that are doing EME on, say, 10 gigahertz are finding them. I heard on a recent podcast that you can actually buy one that's kind of made of material, like an umbrella that kind of opens up and gives you that. So then you can take it out of the weather and you're not using it.
That's interesting. I will take a look for that because I haven't seen anything like that. And then also for radio astronomical purposes, and also for moon bounce, the accuracy of the shape of the antenna, we're talking about millimeter accuracy here. It has to be very accurate.
Well, I'll find out what that dish antenna is, and I'll put that in the show notes page so that it can be a resource for everyone who thinks that they want an 8-foot dish in their backyard.
I'd love 8-foot. That'd be great.
Moon bounce or radio astronomy.
So I'll just add, I'm unlikely to do moon bounce. If I do moon bounce, it'll be as a listener, and so maybe I can help do spots for those guys. But I'm uncomfortable with those kind of power densities anywhere close to my house or anywhere there are children in the neighborhood. I don't want those kind of power densities around here.
Let me ask you, for your radio astronomy receiver, what do you have in mind? How do you think you're going to receive those signals from space?
Well, how...
Are you thinking of a software-defined radio? Do you?
Oh, yes.
You wouldn't use the BC349 or something like that?
No. It'll be software-defined radio. I have a custom feed that I'll construct for this purpose. I'll use software-defined radio. I hope to... one of the major challenges here is to motorize and have very nice computer control for the aiming of the dish. And there are a number of really good ideas. I also belong to SARA, the Society of Amateur Radio Astronomers, and those guys have some really good ideas for that kind of stuff. And basically, my instrument will be a spectrometer. I'll start out with the hydrogen hyperfine spectral line, and then I'll go to the OH and other lines as well. And I'll use it to map the galactic core. And basically what I'm interested in is the entire dark matter issue. What I want to do is to verify the velocity profile in the galactic arms, and do my own investigation and convince myself that indeed dark matter is involved here. I don't know whether you're aware, but dark matter is a major issue in astrophysics today. Nobody knows what it is, but we see evidence of it. So.
I think that's a great way to leverage your background and abilities with amateur radio.
Yes, indeed. It all fits.
What do you think the greatest challenge is facing amateur radio now?
Well, as far as greatest, I think that amateur radio, partly because of Joe Taylor and his group, the invention of and cultivation and continual refinement of the digimodes has been quite the boon to amateur radio. I think it has increased participation a great deal. Now, where I think there is a problem is in the various regulations associated with HOA. These associations that prevent amateurs from putting up antennas. And that's kind of a problem, and I feel for, these are people in retirement communities about my age. And by the way, that also is part of what is motivating my talk, because my antenna, this vertical Yagi-Uda array, you can't see it if you don't know it's there. You have to really look in order to see any evidence of an antenna. And this is a high gain antenna relatively high gain for 40 and 20 meters. So at any rate, I think that's a problem. And of course, we have the perennial issues of getting young people involved. I have 2 daughters and a son, and I'm periodically I encourage them to, and they're all technical. And I encourage them to get involved in amateur radio. And I have friends, that I'm trying to get involved in, what have you. People are very busy. And many don't seem to have they kind of look at it and say, well, I have this phone, I can call anywhere in the world, and it's in my hand, and I can even do video conferencing all over the world.
What do you think the appeal, though, is, JB, to your daughter, for example? What would appeal to her about ham radio?
Well, my latest, and this is very cheap, my latest attempt at this has been to say, okay, when I do FT8, when I do Digimodes, it has very much the dynamics of a video game. And I got just the slightest peak of interest there because they all play video games. They're of that generation. And I'm not sure how to sell it. This is part of the challenge, is to get the young people involved, and somehow, relative to all this other technology that we have available to us, internet, cellular technology in various forms, so on and so forth. Why amateur radio? Well, when I look back at my own experiences, it wasn't just the fact. In fact, it wasn't really the notion that I could talk to people around the world. There was something mystical about sending a signal originating at your own home and through no other artifice except the ionosphere, to be able to have that signal be received halfway around the world. And then all the physics and all the interesting, the antenna stuff, and then the intricacies of the communications equipment itself, all of that factored in. And it for me, it was just utterly fascinating. So I haven't quite yet figured out a good answer to that question as yet, and I will look forward to listening to anybody who has some other ideas.
Well, it's funny. I'm sitting here changing even what I think about, what the attraction is. I'm not a big talker on the radio. I'm mostly a listener and have been for almost 50 years. I think you're causing me to think about this a little bit differently.
That's to your credit, sir. That's to your credit.
What I'm saying, though, is I think that what has always appealed to me about amateur radio is it's a door that once opened, it leads me to interesting technical problems to solve. So maybe it's the intellectual stimulation that comes from participating in the hobby that seems to make the difference.
Yes, I'm sure it's a collection of factors for you as well as for me, and perhaps for virtually every other amateur that we talk to. The challenge is to distill that into a message that will resonate with young people before they can turn you off. Because they'll just say, oh, you're old and that's old stuff and we're not interested in that. I want to get around that somehow.
I think you're right. What advice would you give to newer returning hams?
Amateur radio is so diverse. I mean, there's all kinds of advice that I could give. Once licensed, I would say do a preponderance of listening, because in listening, you're going to learn much more quickly. But of course, be present. A lot of the DX that I work is because I wake up at night and my radio is on and I go and see, well, hey, where is the propagation right now? Are there any new and interesting stations I can work? So doing something like DXCC, achieving something like DXCC, which is something that I never dreamed of doing, actually, but much of it is due to the fact that I'm present. And so listen, be present, expose yourself to people doing other sorts of interesting things. For example, we haven't talked at all about building equipment or restoring equipment. And I know of individual amateurs who are masters at this sort of thing. that I met completely by chance. I happened to QSO with them and then look up their page on QRZ and see that these are really interesting people and they're doing interesting things. And so, try different modes, try different things. That's the advice that I would give.
Well, I think that's great advice. And I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast, JB. I'm looking forward to your presentation at the next QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo. And I encourage the listeners to not only look at the show notes page for this episode, but also to go over to the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo website and look at the presentation section. And you'll find not only JB's amazing presentation that I'm looking forward to, but also about 87 others. With that, I want to thank you so much, JB, and wish you 73.
Thank you, Eric. 73's 4Z1UG. I hope to see you on 40 meters. I need Israel for DXCC, so please get on 40-meter FT8 and let me give you a call. So it's been a pleasure and an honor. Thank you so much, Eric. 73.
73, JB. That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with JB. Be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in K8OS in the search box at the top of the page. Be sure to click on the Expo menu item at the top of the page for updates on the upcoming QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo. I'm updating it as I have more information. My thanks to ICOM America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of ICOM America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart, Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.